Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to everyone who's joined the HMIS data quality training on critical dates and overlapping enrollments. So we'll get started at this time. A friendly reminder to enter your name and your agency name into the chat box for attendance. So for today's training, we ask that you submit any questions you may have through the Q&A feature, which should be located on the toolbar of your Zoom screen. So this helps our team ensure that your questions aren't missed, and in some cases to determine if a help desk ticket is needed for further support. So for today's training, we'll be reviewing the HUD data collection terms and data collection requirements for HMIS Data Elements 3.10 Project Start, 3.11 Project Exit, and 3.20 Housing Move-in Date. We'll be providing a review of overlapping enrollments and how to correct them. And then we'll go over some reports and best practices for data quality, followed by a Q&A session. So please note that the recording for the training and all meeting materials will be made available on the OCHMIS website under the HMIS Help and HMIS Recorded Trainings dropdown. So before we get started, I wanted to share some context to build our foundation around collecting and entering any data element and the language used to describe how to collect that data. So HUD has a very structured approach to collecting data and uses this terminology to organize information about each data element for the HUD data standards, which ensures consistency, clarity, and accurate reporting across all HMIS projects. So when reviewing the HUD data standards manual, you'll see the top box labeled data collection instruction, and it's used for every single data element. So these are the requirements for data entry using keywords and phrases to help identify the who the data is collected about, the what funder is requiring the data to be collected, the which project type is required to collect and report the data element, and the when the data should be collected. So today we're focusing on universal data elements, and those are listed in the table at the right. Universal data elements are required to be collected for all projects about all clients participating in HMIS, regardless of the funding source. So they help produce unduplicated estimates of the number of people experiencing homelessness and accessing services. They provide context about demographic characteristics of the participants who we serve. And in HMIS, universal data elements are found on the client profile, project enrollment, and project exit screens. So we're going to focus on three critical date elements: project start date, the project exit date, and the housing move-in date. So the first one we'll be covering is 3.10 project start. The project start date should be the start of each client's period of participation with the project. So for the project start data element, the who is all clients, the what is all funder programs and components, the which is all project types, and the when is on the enrollment screen or upon enrollment. So HUD provides some additional notes about data collection for this element. Each client's project enrollment must have one project start date. Errors in entering the date should be corrected as soon as they are noticed. And this data element indicates a client is now being assisted by the project as defined by the project type. If a new client is added to the household after the original household member start dates, the new client start date should reflect the actual day that the client started the project. So different project types use the project start date differently to address the difference in the meaning associated with, quote, starting residential service and permanent housing projects. So for street outreach, this is the date of the first contact with the client. For emergency shelter entry exit, this is the night the client first stayed in the shelter. And for night by night, after recording the project start date, clients are allowed to re-enter as necessary without exiting and restarting for each stay for a specific period. So they're enrolled and then using a bed night service to record the nights that they spend the night. For safe haven and transitional housing, this is the date the client moves into the residential project. And then for permanent housing, and that includes rapid rehousing, it's the date the client was admitted into the project. And to be admitted means three things. They meet the criteria for admission. The client has indicated they want to be housed in this project, and the client is able to access services and housing through the project. So the expectation is that the project has a housing opening or expects to have one in a reasonably short amount of time. And then finally, for other service projects like services only or homelessness prevention, this is the date the client first began working with the project and generally received the first provision of service. So data quality starts when you begin entering data for the client. So for this data element, remember that the project start date defaults to the current day. So be sure to update the project start date to the correct date that the client enrolled in your project. So the second data element is the 3.11 project exit. So for the project exit data element, the who is all clients, the what is all funding programs and all components, the which is the project type, it's all project types, and when is the data collected? It's collected at the exit screen. So for some HUD notes on this, each client's project exit must have one project exit date. Errors in entering the date should be corrected as soon as they are noticed. And if a member of the household leaves the project before the rest of the household, the leaver's exit date should reflect the actual day that the client left the project. So like project start, the project exit element is collected differently depending on the project type. So for street outreach, it's the date of last contact with the client. For emergency shelter entry exit, it's the last day of a continuous stay before the client transfers to a different residential project or stops residing in the project. And then for night by night, it's the exit date should be the day after the last recorded bed night. For safe haven and transitional housing, it's the date the client moves out of the residential project. And then for permanent housing, the last day the client lived in the unit or received rental assistance. If the client is moving directly into a new apartment, but through the same project, and there are no days without housing, you don't record an exit. Clients in rapid rehousing projects are to be exited after the last rapid rehousing service is provided. So if eligible rapid rehousing case management services are provided past the final date of receiving rental assistance, the client must not be exited until those services end. And then finally, for the last project type, other service projects, including services only and HP, It's the last day a contact was made or a service was provided. So when entering data for this element, make sure you keep data quality in mind. Remember that the exit date also defaults to the current day's date. So be sure to update the project date to the correct date that the client exited. And then the last data element we'll cover today is the 3.20 housing move-in date. The housing move-in date data element is a critical point in time data that differentiates those that have already moved into permanent housing from households who are enrolled in a permanent housing project, but who are still literally homeless. This element has a more specific set of data requirements than project start and project exit. So, for example, paired with 3.10 project start, it becomes possible to determine the length of time from project start to when housing placement occurs for clients accessing permanent housing. And so this is the date the client or household moves into the permanent living situation. And move-in means a lease arrangement has been made, the client has a key or entry ability to the unit, and the client has physically slept in the unit. So this is collected for the who is the client household, client universe is the head of household. The what is what funder component, and it's all programs and all permanent housing components pay for success and all component types. And then which project types, it's all PH projects. And there's another one other and one services. There's services only project types. And then the when is this is collected at the point of move-in. So as a note, this date may or may not align with the lease date. If your agency needs to collect lease dates for auditing or other purposes, you can request that as a custom field, or you can keep a copy of the data standards documentation to share with auditors to explain the discrepancy. So when entering data for this data element, again, keep data quality in mind. There is no default for this date. So ensure to enter the housing move-in date to reflect the date the client physically moved into the unit, and that date is on or after the project start date. So I'm going to pause for any questions. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or unmute yourself. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so we're going to move on to overlapping enrollments and corrections. One of the most pervasive errors we see is overlapping enrollments. So these errors are created when data shows that a client is occupying two beds at the same time, which is an impossibility in most cases. Data entry errors for these critical dates or duplicate enrollments contribute to this error. For emergency shelters, this affects length of stay. And to give you an example, the current COC threshold for length of stay is 30 days or less. The COC's current average is 162 days. And this will keep increasing without data cleanup. For residential projects, this affects unit utilization scores. Higher or lower than expected unit utilization percentage should prompt agencies to review their data. So HUD has classified overlapping enrollment errors into a pyramid of levels. So level one, which is that bottom level, this is entry to exit dates. Level two is bed night dates. Level three is housing move-in dates. And level four is housing vouchers and housing supports. And we'll discuss each level in the next few slides. So on the first level of the hierarchy includes residential projects that use the project start date and project exit date to indicate that the household is occupying a unit on that date. There are physical units in a building or buildings that are owned or operated by the project, and that the client cannot still be considered in residing in once the exit date has been recorded. So this includes most or all year-round units in a site-based emergency shelter using an entry-exit method. It also includes transitional housing projects and safe havens. So the error logic here is that it is physically impossible for a client to be in two different beds at the same time, and these should be found and fixed immediately. These overlaps are considered easy to fix by using good data quality knowledge as you are entering data for these elements and subsequent reviews of the data. So we're going to cover some scenarios for each of the levels of the pyramid, and we'll start with this first level. So the first scenario is where a client enters an emergency shelter on January 4th, spends the night, and leaves the morning of January 5th, and then contacts a different agency to stay in their emergency shelter on the night of the 5th, and then stays through the 10th. So you can see in this top portion, this is correct data entry where the project one has correctly recorded an entry date on January 4th and correctly entered the exit date on January 5th. Project two has correctly entered the enrollment date on the 5th. So even though it shows the same day, this is the morning of, and they're spending the night on January 5th through January 10th. So this next part is an example of incorrect data entry, and this will most likely involve a data entry error. So in this case, the client enrolled correctly in the first project, but incorrectly exited. And so this shows that they were enrolled in the second project before they were exited from the first project, creating a visualization that the client stayed the night in project one and project two. So as we showed earlier, Clarity will autofill the project exit date with the current date. So if data entry for the client, for example, was done on the 6th, it's possible that that date was not updated. And so the exit date should be updated. This is easily missed and the wrong date recorded for the client. So you can go back, update the date to the correct date, and make sure to input the correct date to avoid those errors. So the next level on the hierarchy includes residential projects that use project start date and project exit date to indicate the household is occupying that unit on that date, and projects that use bed night date to indicate the household is occupying the unit on that date. So this is emergency shelters using entry exit and emergency shelters using a night by night method. So these overlapping enrollments are also physically impossible and should be fixed nearly 100% of the time. However, they may also contain 1 or 2 days of overlap that may be explained by shelter closure or opening times or other situations outside the client's control. So in our scenario, we have a client who enters an emergency shelter on January 4th, They spend the night and they leave the morning of January 5th and then contacts a different agency to stay in their night by night project the night of January 5th. So you can see the correct data entry here. And for an incorrect or it would be any overlap of more than 2 consecutive days. So those should be fixed. 1 or 2 days can be explained. And it's important to keep record of the explanation. You can keep it in the client record so that you can provide that explanation later. So the second scenario is where a client enters a night by night on January 4th and leaves in the morning of January 5th, but returns on the 6th. And in the interim, the client contacts a different agency on the 5th to stay in the night by night, and then stays on through. So you can see the correct data entry here where they start the project and a bed night service is entered on January 5th because they did not stay the night. Bed night service was not entered. And then on the 6th, where the client did stay the night again, a service was entered. And then, so there's no overlapping of services and no overlap of stays. And you can see for project 2, recorded for January 5th, and then the stay through until the client exited. So the incorrect data entry would be here, where it's a similar scenario, except for project 1 accidentally input a service for January 5th where the client didn't spend the night. And so this is showing that the client spent the night in 2 places at one time, which again should be resolved 100% of the time. So for level 3, these are residential projects that use the project start date and project exit date or the bed night date to indicate that the household is occupying that unit on that date. And to indicate the household is occupying that unit, pardon me, uh, and residential projects that use the housing move-in date and project exit date to indicate the household is occupying the unit on that date. So these projects are where occupancy in the unit is defined by the housing move-in date rather than the project start date. So the key to understanding this type of overlap and why it's problematic for utilization is because in HMIS, once a client has a housing move-in date recorded in a rapid rehousing or other PH project, while still having enrollments in other residential projects like emergency shelter or transitional housing, the implication is that the household is in 2 separate units at the same time, which again is physically impossible. Though we really appreciate the hard work our community providers are providing through outreach, referral linkage, and housing navigation. But HUD has a saying, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So please remember to accurately document the client program record as we want to ensure those outcomes are accurately reflected in the data. So most scenarios in this are physically impossible. They should be fixed nearly 100% of the time with information provided as to why the overlaps were not resolved by local data quality controls. So for this scenario, we have a client enrolled in an emergency shelter on January 4th and has a project exit on January 15th. The client is being placed in permanent housing and was enrolled and has a housing move-in date. So you can see they were enrolled for project 1. This is the emergency shelter on the 4th. And then sometime in here, they were enrolled, accepted, enrolled into the permanent housing project, and then recorded their housing move-in date when the client was exited from this project. So you can see this is an accurate data entry. An incorrect data entry would be where the same scenario occurs for project one, where they're enrolled on the 4th and exited on the 15th. But project two has put their housing move-in date on January 9th, such that between January 9th and January 15th, it's showing that the client stayed in two places at the same time. And so this level four, it's the last level on the pyramid, is when residential projects that use a housing move-in date and a project exit date to indicate the household is occupying that unit on that date are using supportive services to support housing supplied by other residential projects that use the housing move-in date and project exit date to indicate the household is occupying the unit on that date. So that's a lot of words, but so it discusses the overlap between funders that have provided flexibility in the eligible uses of residential project grants to assist households to move into and maintain units paid for by other residential project grants. So this might be where an emergency shelter or a rapid rehousing project overlaps with a permanent housing project. So the error logic is that it can be fixed, but there are some overlaps that are possible. Unresolved overlaps should be noted with a reason for any overlaps not resolved by local data quality controls or HMIS project setup changes. And they're mostly easy to fix. So I'm going to point out one situation where an overlap is allowed. So in SSVF projects, they may support clients with a security deposit assistance, which is where we might see an overlap with a VASH program. So in this case, it's very important to document this in the client record to provide an explanation of the overlap. So on to a scenario. So this involves a client who has an enrollment in a permanent housing project on January 4th, 2025, and a move-in date on January 9th, 2025. And then has a project exit on January 15th, 2026 due to an end of project funding. So the client is being administratively placed. So they didn't change units, but in HMIS, they are being moved to a different permanent housing project. And they were enrolled and they have a housing move-in date. So this top portion is correct data entry, where you've got the project one that has the January 4th, 2025 enrollment, the original housing move-in, and then this space of a year showing the January 15th project exit. And then for this second PH project, it shows the project start and the housing move-in date on the same day. Because if you remember with the housing move-in date, it can be on or after the project start. And then the client continues on in that project. So the incorrect data for this is the client is project one, where it's the same scenario. But in project two, the data was entered where the housing move-in date was the original date that was recorded for project one. And that is incorrect. So this should be changed to the correct day, either typically the project start of project two, in order to correct this error. And so I do see that we have a question. So if a client loses one rapid rehousing program but is immediately transferred to another rapid rehousing program without ever losing their unit, is the housing move-in date with their original move-in date, or do we use the new program enrollment date? So again, thank you for your question. You can also submit a ticket to our help desk. We would like to offer additional support on that to understand some of the specifics on your question. But if if it's like the last scenario that we described, where the project possibly lost funding, um, then the housing move-in date would be the program start date of the second project. But feel free, please, to submit a ticket to us, and we'll be happy to investigate further. So, data quality, why does it matter? So, data errors such as missing data, entering incorrect dates, or forgetting to update from the default date, and errors causing overlapping enrollments lead to an inaccurate snapshot of our system and performance outcomes, which are per performance with the project performance report scores and HUD systems performance scores. This leads to loss of funds. So your agency's projects are scored to measure their effectiveness. Consistently low scoring projects will be reviewed for funding redistribution. HUD uses project performance reports and other reports to measure the effectiveness of the COC, where we lose points on the COC application. And then finally, it affects the COC's ability to obtain critical funding during the NOFO and other funding for projects. So, reports and resources, where to go for help. So one of the first things I'd like to show you are some reports that are available that you can run anytime. So from the Clarity Launchpad, you're going to go to Reports, you go to Data Analysis tab, and you go to the first section, which is Built-in Reports. And you can see the screenshot below. And so the two reports that I'd like to point out are the LSA Data Cleanup Length of Stay and Utilization Review and the LSA Data Cleanup Overlapping Enrollments. And we would suggest that you create your own monthly schedule of reports to run and review to catch data errors quickly. So monthly is good. Even more frequently is even better. But please review these reports, and they are also filterable by your agency name or even project name. So the other reports I'd like to point out are also on the data analysis tab, but not in the built-in reports, but in the Orange County Clarity System reports tab. And that would be the data accuracy dashboard and the data accuracy details. And so these are the two reports here. We have a section under the Orange County Clarity System reports, and we have a whole data quality section where you'll see a whole list of possible data quality reports to run. So with that, I'm going to jump into a quick demo to show you how to access these reports and what they look like. Bear with me while I switch screens and switch over to Clarity. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is the training site, and I'm on the OC Training Agency. So what I'm going to do is click on the Launchpad, go to Reports, go to Data Analysis, and first we'll look at the built-in reports. That would be here. You can see there is a whole list of reports. The ones that I was referring to were these two here, the data LSA data cleanup ones, household and pardon me, the length of stay and utilization overview, and the overlapping enrollments. But yeah, honestly, any of these other data quality tools would be helpful as you review your data. So we'll look at the length of stay utilization overview. And I'm going to update to my agency name. And so this will give you a report. So this specifically is on entry exit, emergency shelters for length of stay. But you can see this is separated by project, and then the average days in the projects to the right. And so you can see this has a pretty large average length days in project. So you can click on that to get a list of clients who are in that shelter and who have a length of stay. And so you can see, for example, this client with a length of stay of 265 days, you can see that they don't have a project exit date. So probably the best thing to do, you can click on the enrollment ID, click on the Clarity Program Enrollment, and you can go straight to their enrollment history. And you know that this client should have been exited. So you can go straight to the exit screen. This has a client's, I'm just going to end it for this particular client. Make sure to update the project exit date for the correct day that the client was exited, fill in the rest of these, make changes if necessary, and then click Save and Close. So that is a good way to use this report to directly affect the data entry errors. Get out of this. And so the next one I'm going to do review is I'm going to exit from that client and go back to data analysis. We're going to look, I'm just going to show you the report where it is. So this is Orange County Clarity System Reports. And if you scroll down, you can see the sections here. Just go down to the data quality section, and the data accuracy dashboard is right here where you would run it. And you can also filter by your agency name or your project name. So I'm going to stop share real quickly and go back to the slides. Okay, so the other things I'd like to cover are resources, other resources than the reports. And these are knowledge-based articles that we have available. You can go there directly from our website. So we have a project start date, KB, and all these have videos with them as well, right within the KB. So you've got project start date, we have project exit date, housing move-in date. There's a street outreach exiting protocol. HMIS dual enrollments and HIC duplicate training. This is a resource that HUD put out. This is also a resource that HUD put out. And then the project performance overview, which details the list of goals, and then what goes into those goals. So that is the end of our training. We're going to pause for any Q&A. If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or ask your question in the Q&A option. So I'm not seeing any questions. If you have specific questions about your agency or your projects or specific clients, please feel free to submit a question to our help desk, and we will be happy to help you on that question to provide some guidance to correct any errors. We want to thank you very much for attending this training and have a great day today. And we will be providing a follow-up survey, and we would love if you would be able to respond to the survey and give us some feedback. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.